On today's episode of the Post Christian podcast, I have with me JR Woodward. How are you doing, JR?
Hey man, doing well. How about yourself?
It's good. It's a beautiful day here in Austin, Texas. I know you're up in Seattle,
Yeah,
and
yeah. Nice day
Seattle
here too.
summers are the best.
They
They
are. Yeah,
are.
definitely.
Excited for you. Well, it's good to see you again.
That's
We ran
yeah,
across each other, knew each other in my LA days, which I guess were your LA days too, when we both lived there.
yeah,
You've
yeah,
gone to help plant churches. Now you're with V3, coaching church planters. You're an author, part of the board of Missio Alliance. Let me just ask you kind of a big question. What
yeah.
are you seeing in terms of innovations, in terms of things that encourage you when it comes to planting in a post-Christian world that we see more and more in places like where you've lived, Seattle, college towns in Virginia, Hawaii? What are some of the things you're seeing that get you excited?
Yeah. I think like a couple of things. One would be just people that take discipleship seriously and have a structure that actually enables that to happen. I think too often our structures can inhibit us from actually focusing on helping see more mature. Because I think in a lot of ways, part of the difficulty and why we're in a post-Christian space is we've kind of failed to be mature pictures of Jesus, and I think that is the critical need. And then I would say, one, I think when we understand like the church at our heart is communion, like our relation with God, that 24/7 type of thing, community, and then the commission, which is involves both the larger mission and discipleship. If we think about that and then creatively think, what is it, how can we be this? Like there's so many creative ways to do that. And if you kind of match that to what I feel like are the six kind of like primal human needs or desires, like purpose and justice and our desire to belong, healing and wholeness, truth, at least as it corresponds to reality, and beauty. Like just think about like what could the church be if it's these three C's, seeking to meet the world's kind of primal needs in these areas. I
Mm.
think that's kind of those who are kind of exploring that and thinking about doing that in a way that really connects with people today. That's probably one of the things that excites me.
Well, it reminds me a lot of your book, Creating a Missional Culture.
Mm,
What you're describing there, the foreword by Alan Hirsch, another mutual
hmm
friend of ours. What did you maybe talk a little bit about some of the insights in that book that you still think churches are missing, or is just something that maybe some churches that aren't familiar with your work
Yeah.
need to really consider?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think the fivefold intelligence, the whole apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher is starting to gain a lot of traction. Besides Alan and Mike Breen and Neil Cole, and there's just a lot of different books coming out that kind of affirm, similar thing. And so I think that's starting to take ground, which is really encouraging. I'm and maybe in some areas, but probably not enough. I would say the whole polycentric leadership is important, and I think people still struggle with that. I do think though we are probably at a cultural moment that we're at least kind of looking at maybe there's something to this. Maybe we need to kind of get out of this rigid hierarchy that we probably have adopted more from the business CEO model than we have the scripture. And because oftentimes it's like the kings, there's a few good ones, but most people cannot withstand that structure. I don't think it's kind of designed for one person to be at that place. And so I would say that would be a thing. And then probably just looking at the whole culture of the congregation and the different elements that are a part of it, and making sure giving some credence to not just kind of vision, values, and um, mission, but like concrete practices that we're engaging in and marks like what are we actually moving toward, what does maturity of the whole congregation look like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a sad reality that
Mm,
because
mm,
of the fall of leaders in the church, it does make the church not just look bad, but our voice is diminished. And your newest book, which I'm real excited
Mm.
about, The Scandal of Leadership, kind of takes that on. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's important because you're writing about discipleship. Another one of your books is all about the movement, the church's
Hmm.
movement, and
Hmm.
those things can be completely derailed when the person
Mm.
responsible uh, ruins things. So maybe talk to us a little bit about this new book. Why did you tackle this very
Mm.
difficult topic, and what are some of the things that you share with us in the book?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right, let me see if I should be able to have this down right. My elevator. Well, it was over 20 years ago that I got interested in this, and it was mostly because in the organization I was a part of, like I would see kind of, and I'm talking about like not just kind of the local, but the translocal organization, and seeing kind of the person who would kind of get in that lead role. uh, they seemed like to be a good person, and they became less good when they got in that space, and that just seemed to continue. I remember then being asked to speak at the pastors' gathering, which is fairly common, but they asked me one year to talk on spiritual warfare, and I'm like, okay, like it's an interesting topic. It's given some thought to it, but I would say being on a campus church and a lot of other campuses, like we weren't like casting out demons every other day. So I was trying to think of like, how am I going to hit this that really connects with people today? Not that demon possession that can't happen. It just it wasn't somebody a practice that most people were engaging in, and so I started to get I guess for there like starting to kind of put this idea of spiritual warfare and problematic and leadership together. And so the scandal of leadership was somewhat born by developing a deeper theology of the powers. And when I say the powers, I'm kind of talking about Satan, the demonic, and the principalities and powers. I think in a lot of ways, if we think about those in a pre-modern view, we probably just dismiss them as unimportant. We give not a second thought toward it. Maybe we'll bring them in here and there, but it feels like a little bit archaic. Uh, and but then at the same time, like, so I think a lot of times they're not, we kind of dismiss them, or we could like in modernity, like Rudolf Bultmann, he was a demythologizer. So instead of like taking the powers seriously as kind of real entities, he demythologized them, meaning like he kind of explained this is a scriptural story, but really what this means is our human struggles that we're dealing with, and it's just another way to describe those. What I do in the skin of leadership is I take a serious look at the theology of the powers as another level of analysis of what's happening with fallen leadership. And I look at it, you could say I kind of re-mythologize it. In other words, that there is a reality to these, but it's probably not our pre-modern view, and it's certainly not like a modern view. And so, using the dialoguing with Walter Wink, who's probably most known on the powers, um, Rene Girard, kind of a cultural anthropologist, and then William Stringfellow, who was kind of a Harvard grad lawyer, went to Brown and Black Harlem in the late 50s, 60s, and encountered the powers in
Mm.
in New York, in that particular place. And so, that would be a big part of what I'm doing, and just giving another. No, I think if we don't analyze the problem, just if we just do it from a psychological or sociological and not a theological view of the powers, that we're not going to get to the root of the problem.
Mm.
So that's kind of that's a quick
Yeah.
overview, and then I can talk more if it produces some questions.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I feel like there is a sense where the scriptures tell us, to be as innocent as doves, as wise as serpents. We're supposed to know the devil's schemes. If
Yeah,
we are
yeah,
unaware that,
yeah,
pride comes before a fall, and
yeah,
we don't have in place accountability to protect us from our own worst, moments. I mean, even in culture outside of Christianity, we talk about, my demons, and it's usually
yeah.
in
Right.
terms of recovery.
Yeah.
Uh,
That's
I
right.
would love to just, as you dove into the theological understanding of powers, what were some of the things that maybe surprised you in the scriptures that we're not taking as seriously as we need to?
Yeah, I think probably what like Gerard kind of uncovers, and that is kind of the role that imitation plays. You can kind of, I mean, for example, I mean, for example, you can kind of look at, say, Mark Driscoll, one of the founders of Acts 29. He's obviously one of the people that have fallen and kind of through like an unhealthy use of power. He's pretty much admitted that kind of is an issue, and and a lot of people looked up to him. So one of the things that Gerard talks about is his first discovery, really just three big discoveries. I'm going through this quick, and the first is kind of uh, really through the study of literature. And why is it that people like Dostoevsky, Shakespeare, Proust, and others kind of rise to the cream of the crop? His first book was called The Romantic Lie and the Novelistic Truth. And what the novelist eventually discovered in their life is he kind of studied their life and their writings. At some point in their writings, they became great novelists because of this one truth that they all held in common in their stories. And that is what he calls mimetic desire, meaning that we desire the desires of our models. The desire isn't self-generated. It's not like a straight line between me and the object of desire. It's more triangular. Whoever we look up to, we will ultimately desire what they desire. Now, let's kind of put this into a church context. And let's kind of remember we talked about, let's say someone's a lead pastor. That's, we talked about that already. I like polycentric leadership, but let's say they're the lead pastor, but they want to be the lead pastor. Their desire is to be the lead pastor. Okay. Not the work of, but just maybe like the title. Anybody who looks up to them will desire that same thing. Okay. So in this case, the leader becomes an obstacle to the disciple, whom the very desire that they gave them. So when I talk about, like, when Jesus uses the word scandalon or scandal, literally it means obstacle. And this is kind of how I'm using leadership in the first. The scandal of leadership is when the leader actually becomes an obstacle to the disciple because of malformed desires that they have and pass on to their disciples. The second thing that happens is when is that mimetic desire can lead to mimetic rivalry, right? Because in this case, the disciple and whoever is looking up to, say there's multiple disciples here looking up, now they all want to be the lead pastor. And the lead pastor picks up on this subconsciously and desires it even more. And so you get into this snowball effect where mimetic rivalry turns into a mimetic crisis and everybody is against everybody, but nobody knows why. Now, historically, and because Gerard studied anthropology, mythology, when you go to ancient civilizations prior to any judicial law, which kind of helps to quell this kind of rivalry when it gets violent. Before we had that, what would happen is when the crisis would happen, the community would mimetically kind of land on a scapegoat and kill them. So Renee's second whole point is a scapegoat mechanism, and he would basically say, like the devil's been the murder from the beginning. For him, this cycle of that starts with a crisis that leads to the scapegoat mechanism, which eventually kind of creates a sense of peace with the community because they feel like something is resolved, at least for a season, until it starts a cycle again. So for him, this whole cycle is Satan, who's been the murder from the beginning, starting with Cain and Abel. You kind of see this play out. You could say Cain being the first founder of society, that every society since then has been founded on murder. So the scapegoat mechanism is an inherent part of of the human journey and the building of societies. The third thing with that, so what I'm kind of saying is the importance and power of imitation. I think you're kind of starting to see here, because it happens at a subconscious level. But if you want to think about it, Madison Avenue, like the market, all of these things have worked by kind of this imitation and and that's kind of the power that it has. But the third kind of discovery he made as this French intellectual, who, by the way, was the first person to host a postmodern conference here. So his friends were like Theater and all of these
Mm.
postmodern philosophers when he was at Johns Hopkins. His last stay was at Stanford, but his third discovery, which wasn't a something that a French philosopher probably did, was but that the Bible was unique compared to any other literature, and that this where mythology concealed our complicity to this scapegoat mechanism, the scripture kind of reveals our
Yeah.
complicity,
Mm.
and so you kind of have, and you got Joseph, his brothers scapegoat him, but we're told that he's innocent, right? But mostly we see this primarily in Christ. So Christ is scapegoated, right, by the Jews and the Romans, to the point, by the way, in order for the scapegoat mechanism in the past to actually work, everybody had to believe that the victim was guilty. All
Mm.
right. It had to be like, everybody. So when you think about, here's, Jesus' disciples walking with him 3 years, seeing perfect love. And now he's on the way where the crowds are against him. The whole kind of mob mentality has overtaken them. And so not even the disciples, not even Peter, the rock, could stand. I mean, he falls to a 13-year-old girl in Jewish context, that's ridiculous. So the mimetic desire had even taken over the disciples to the point they could no longer identify with Jesus. So
Mm.
Jesus, though, the difference in this is Jesus becomes the willing sacrifice, right? In order to show what's been happening since the foundation of the world.
Mm.
And this way reveals to us, our complicity to violence and so forth. And I would say the interesting thing is this, and I kind of sum up the book with a lot more detail on the remedy, really is understand like we ultimately will either imitate the powers in their submission to Satan, which leads to idolatry and dehumanization and dishonoring God, or we will imitate Christ in submission to his Father, which is freedom from idolatry. It leads to human flourishing and honoring God.
Mm.
That's really what I'm saying. There is no neutral ground. We're either going to imitate the ultimate model of Satan, but I work that out in a way that actually makes sense, or we're going to imitate Christ. And in the end, I look at Philippians through a Girardian viewpoint, and Philippians 2 in particular, to kind of give a more robust remedy. But here's the point: we're all captive to imitation. The choice we have is who we're going to imitate, and it makes a big difference.
That's beautifully said. Well, I was in Seattle in the early 90s, 94 to 98, and I was a college pastor along with Mark Driscoll, who you mentioned earlier. And, the recent fall was obviously, well
Yeah.
covered in that podcast. And it's interesting because around the same time is when I was introduced to the character matrix. And really, when you see someone fall, it's the way Irwin used to describe it. He's the one that kind of introduced me to the character matrix. Is a lot of times the responsibility and the notoriety is bigger than the person's character can withstand because there's a
Yeah.
crack in the foundation. And
Yeah.
so back in '96, I think it was because I probably exhibited some pride. A guy named Matt Birch sat me down and walked me through the character matrix and showed me if I focused on humility and faithfulness and gratitude, the result will be I'll be more like Jesus. And
Mm.
and really focusing, kind of like what you said earlier about imitation. If we're
Mm.
imitating the power and the role, we're
Mm.
actually doing what Jesus said, which is to
Mm.
actually die to self, to
Yeah.
become the
Yeah.
least of others, and to be
Right.
the
Yeah.
servant.
Yeah. Right.
And I love, obviously your work as national director with the V3 movement. I mean, you're
Mm.
investing in pastors all across the world, probably beyond just the scope of what we're doing here in the United States. But what are some of the other things you see church leaders getting sucked into, maybe before they realize it? Maybe give us a couple of preventative thoughts to conclude our time together.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I'll do this by way of kind of my third kind of like partner, William Stringfellow. He kind of talks about the principalities, articulates them in our day in three ways. There's image, institution, and ideology. And so when it comes to image, it's kind of like we all, there's two entities that go by the name of Eric. There's Eric, the person made in the image of God, and then there's Eric, the image. Our temptation is to let our image possess us instead of us possessing our image in God. And he kind of gives the idea there's Marilyn Monroe, the person, Marilyn Monroe, the image. You know, the person is long dead, but the image kind of still lives on. So that is kind of a principality and force, you know, now with social media is even accented and given more power. And so the, you know, and I think this speaks to our identity. Like when I define leadership, I think about there's our identity, our praxis, you know, what we do, and then our telos, kind of where we're going, right? So who we are, what we do, where we're going, and the principalities kind of attack and trying to undermine each of those three. But I would say that our identity and telos shapes our praxis. In other words, how we use power will be based on what our, you know, where we get our sense of identity from. So I would say, yeah, being aware of that and thinking a little bit more about how we form our sense of identity. And when I think about that, if we don't think about it in the context of the powers, I think we're missing the significance of Jesus' temptation in the desert. I mean, think about what happened right before his temptation. You know, this is my, and this is my son in whom I'm well pleased. His sense of identity was given, and then he was forced by the Spirit into the desert. Why? Because that was going to be tested. If you are the Son of God, twice, you know, the first and third by Luke's account, you know, that's the temptation. In the form, it could be an economic temptation, political temptation, or this kind of religious, ideological temptation. And I think that's probably the other thing today. Like, we live in such a polarized world, and I think a lot of people are captive to an ideology without knowing it. There's only one thing that kind of fights an idea. So whether it's conservatism or progressivism or, you know, whatever, all the isms or ideologies that have their own accounts of what's wrong with the world and how do we make it right. And Jesus counters all of that with the good news of the kingdom of God. And I think that we have fallen to the powers again. The church doesn't look much different than the world. We demonize the other. We can't come to the conversation on critical issues anymore. We, you know, throw people off the table because they have like a different opinion on second and third level issues. I think this shows that the powers are very much at work. They're still working at dividing. So if we don't know how to name and unmask them, we won't be able to engage them, and we'll just kind of mirror what we see happening in the world.
Wow. Well, I'm really excited to read your book. Thank you for all that you do to invest not just in the churches within your movement, but the rest of us, part of the kingdom. I'm going to give away a few copies of your book to some of those that are signed up for my email newsletter. So thank you, JR, for what you're doing. Really good to see you again.
Yeah, man. Good to see you too, man.